In the soft glow of an autumn afternoon in 1907, the Blackwood estate stands proud against the rolling Massachusetts countryside. The grand Victorian mansion, with its ornate gables and imposing stone facade, has been home to generations of Blackwoods, a family whose wealth was built on the railroad industry that transformed America. Wrought iron gates guard the long gravel driveway that winds through immaculately kept gardens, where gardeners in worn caps tend to the last roses of the season. The air carries the crisp scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke from the mansion's many chimneys. Today is a special occasion. For the first time in nearly a decade, all 5 Blackwood brothers have returned to their childhood home. Their father, the formidable industrialist Edward Blackwood, has summoned them for the reading of their late mother's will, a full year after her passing. The delay, explained in Edward's telegram as legal complications, had raised eyebrows among Boston's elite social circles, where whispers of family discord had circulated since Elizabeth Blackwood's funeral. The eldest brother James, now 38, arrives first, punctual as always. A successful banker in Boston, he has inherited his father's stern demeanor and business acumen. His black Model T Ford, polished to a mirror shine, sits in the circular driveway like a herald of the modern age against the Victorian backdrop. James paces the entrance hall, pocket watch in hand, awaiting his siblings. His tailored 3-piece suit and perfectly trimmed mustache reflect his position as vice president of First Merchants Bank, where he has earned a reputation for ruthless efficiency. "Harrington," he calls to the aging butler who has served the family since before James was born. "Has there been any word from my brothers?" The train from Boston arrived nearly an hour ago. Harrington, his posture still ramrod straight despite his 70 years, inclines his head slightly. "Master William sent a telegram this morning. He was delayed at the university but promised to arrive by 3 o'clock. As for the others..." The old man's face remains impassive, but James detects a note of disapproval. William, the second brother, arrives next. At 35, he has made his name as a professor of archaeology at Harvard. His scholarly appearance, wire-rimmed spectacles and tweed jacket, contrasts with the rugged good looks he shares with his brothers. Years of excavations in Egypt and Greece have weathered his complexion, and there's a thoughtfulness to his movements that speaks of a man accustomed to handling fragile artifacts. Under his arm, he carries a leather portfolio filled with academic papers and a small wooden box, its contents unknown. "James," he greets his elder brother with a formal handshake that softens into a brief embrace. "How long has it been?" 2 years? 2 years and 4 months, James replies precisely. "At Mother's funeral." William nods solemnly, removing his spectacles to clean them with a handkerchief. "I received your letters about Father's health. Has there been any improvement?" Before James can answer, the sound of automobile wheels on gravel, accompanied by the blaring of a horn, announces another arrival. The brothers move to the bay window overlooking the driveway, where a gleaming Packard touring car has pulled up with a flourish. The vehicle, painted a flashy red that seems out of place against the subdued grandeur of the estate, can only belong to one person. Thomas, 33, comes stumbling through the door shortly after, already half drunk and full of boisterous laughter. The family's black sheep, he has squandered much of his inheritance on gambling and women in New York's bustling nightlife. His suit is of the finest quality but rumpled, as if slept in, and his cravat is askew. Despite his dishevelment, Thomas possesses a charisma that has charmed his way out of countless scrapes. "My distinguished brothers," he announces, spreading his arms theatrically. "The prodigal returns." His words are slightly slurred, but his eyes are sharp beneath the affected joviality. James's disapproval is palpable. "You're late, Thomas, and intoxicated as usual." Thomas waves away the criticism. "The train was delayed, or perhaps I was delayed getting to the train. The details escape me." He winks at Harrington, who receives his coat and hat with practiced neutrality. William intervenes before James can respond. "Have you heard from Charles and Henry? Are they arriving together?" The 2 youngest brothers arrive together. Charles, 30, a quiet and contemplative doctor who has recently returned from studying medicine in Europe, and Henry, 28, the artistic soul of the family who has been living in Paris, pursuing his passion for photography. They step from a hired cab, Charles paying the driver while Henry supervises the unloading of several large cases containing his photographic equipment. Charles is the most reserved of the brothers. His medical training in Vienna has given him a clinical perspective on life, and his eyes, the same deep brown as his siblings, Observe everything with scientific detachment. His movements are precise, economical, and his words when he speaks are carefully chosen. A recent bout with tuberculosis has left him thinner than his brothers remember, though he dismisses their concerns with professional authority. Henry, by contrast, is all artistic passion and modern ideas. The youngest Blackwood has embraced the bohemian lifestyles of European art circles, evident in his slightly longer hair and the colorful scarf tucked into his otherwise conventional suit. Where his brothers followed established paths, banking, academia, medicine, Henry has forged his own way, his photography earning critical acclaim in Paris galleries. His return to America was prompted not only by his father's summons, but by his desire to document the rapidly changing face of his homeland. "The prodigal son's return," Thomas quips, raising his flask in greeting as Charles and Henry enter the foyer. "Now our father can slaughter the fatted calf. That's not how the parable goes," Charles notes dryly, setting down his medical bag. "And you seem to be doing enough slaughtering of your own liver." Despite his words, there's affection in the way he clasps Thomas's shoulder. Henry embraces each brother in turn, his enthusiasm genuine. "It's good to see you all, even you, Thomas, in whatever state you've arrived." He turns to James. "Has father said anything about why he delayed the will reading for so long? Mother's been gone a year now." James shakes his head. "Father communicates little these days. His health has declined significantly since you left for Europe. He spends most days confined to his rooms in the West Wing." A shadow of concern crosses Henry's expressive face. "Is it his heart again?" "Among other ailments," William interjects. "Age is catching up with him, I'm afraid." The doctors say, as the brothers gather in the grand sitting room. The family butler, Harrington, who has served the Blackwoods for over 30 years, announces that their father will be delayed until evening. The old man, now in his 70s, has been in declining health and spends most of his time in the west wing of the mansion. The sitting room, with its dark mahogany paneling and heavy velvet draperies, seems to absorb the late afternoon light, creating pools of shadow in the corners. Family portraits dating back generations line the walls, austere faces staring down at the assembled brothers with painted judgment. "Your father extends his apologies," Harrington says, his British accent still pronounced despite decades in America. His physician, Dr. Morrison, has advised him to rest before dinner. The excitement of having all his sons return home has rather overwhelmed him. There's a hint of something unspoken in the butler's tone, perhaps concern, perhaps warning. James nods, accustomed to taking charge in his father's absence. "We understand. Please inform father that we'll await his convenience." "Typical," Thomas mutters, dropping into a leather armchair without invitation. "Summon us all with urgent telegrams, then make us wait. Some things never change." William shoots him a reproachful look. "Have some respect, Thomas. Father is not well." "Gentlemen," Harrington continues with a slight bow, seemingly unperturbed by the brothers' tension, "your father has requested that while you wait, you fulfill a wish of your late mother's. She had hoped to see all her sons together one last time for a family portrait. Master Henry, with your expertise in photography, your father thought you might arrange this." Henry nods, pleased to put his skills to use. "I brought my equipment, as father requested in his letter. We can set up in the garden, where the light is best this time of day." "An excellent suggestion, sir," Harrington agrees. "I've taken the liberty of having your cases brought to the East Terrace. The gardeners have been instructed to stay clear of the area to afford you privacy." "Thank you, Harrington," Henry says warmly. "You always anticipate everything." The old butler's expression softens momentarily. "It is my pleasure to serve the Blackwood family, as it has been since your grandfather's time." With another small bow, he withdraws, leaving the brothers alone. Charles moves to the window, gazing out at the gardens where they played as children. "It's strange being back here all together. The house feels both familiar and foreign at once, like stepping into a memory." William agrees, joining him, though some memories are best left undisturbed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Thomas challenges, already pouring himself a drink from the crystal decanter on the sideboard, ignoring James's disapproving frown. "Nothing ominous," William assures him, "just that childhood recollections are often gilded by nostalgia. The reality is usually more complicated." James checks his pocket watch again, a nervous habit he's developed over years of business meetings where time equals money. "We should proceed with Mother's wishes. The light won't last much longer, and Father will expect us to have completed the task before dinner." The brothers make their way to the garden, where the maple trees are ablaze with autumn colors. The afternoon sun slants through the branches, creating a dappled light that any photographer would covet. Henry begins setting up his camera, a magnificent new Kodak, on its wooden tripod. His movements are practiced and precise as he assembles the equipment, checking the bellows for light leaks and adjusting the lens aperture with delicate turns of his fingers. This is a fine instrument, Charles observes, examining the camera with professional interest. The latest model? Henry nods, pleased by his brother's recognition. Just released this year. The advances in photographic technology have been remarkable. This has a faster shutter speed and better lens clarity than anything I've used before. He pats the camera affectionately. I've been documenting the changing architecture of Paris with it, the contrast between the medieval and the modern. Fascinating, William says, genuinely interested. Photography is transforming how we preserve history. In my field, we're just beginning to utilize it systematically for archaeological documentation. Thomas, growing bored with the technical discussion, wanders to the stone balustrade overlooking the lower gardens. Do you remember the last time we were all together like this? He asks, pulling a silver flask from his jacket pocket. James frowns disapprovingly. Mother's funeral. And before you take another sip, remember this is meant to honor her memory. Thomas pauses, the flask halfway to his lips. For a moment, genuine grief crosses his handsome features. Elizabeth Blackwood had always had a soft spot for her middle son, defending his excesses when Edward would have cut him off entirely. Thomas reluctantly returns the flask to his pocket, a rare concession to propriety. Actually, Charles interjects, adjusting his tie as a breeze stirs the garden. I believe it was Christmas of '98, before the Spanish-American War, before Father's expansion into the Western railroads. William nods thoughtfully, his historian's mind cataloging the timeline. Yes, that's right. Before everything changed. Before Mother fell ill. Henry adds quietly. The brothers fall silent, each lost in their own memories of the past decade, a time that has seen them grow apart as surely as the new century has transformed the world around them. The Spanish-American War had called James to service briefly, while William had embarked on his first major archaeological expedition to Egypt. Charles had begun his medical studies in Boston before continuing in Europe, and Henry had discovered his passion for photography while documenting the 1900 World's Fair in Paris. Only Thomas had remained largely unchanged, drifting between New York's social circles and the family's various properties, leaving a trail of scandals in his wake. Elizabeth Blackwood's mysterious illness had begun around that time as well, a gradual weakening that no doctor could properly diagnose. For 7 years she had declined, becoming bedridden in the last 2. The brothers had visited separately during her final months, but never all together, their schedules and perhaps their reluctance to face the inevitable keeping them apart. Henry adjusts the camera, peering through the viewfinder. The late afternoon sun bathes the garden in golden light, perfect for capturing the somber mood of the occasion. Stand together, please, by the stone bench. The 4 brothers arrange themselves as Henry directs, James standing tall and straight at the center, William and Charles seated on the bench, Thomas leaning casually against the marble balustrade. Behind them, the garden stretches toward the woods that mark the edge of the Blackwood property, a vista unchanged since their childhood. Perfect, Henry says, making a final adjustment to the camera's focus. Now hold still. This exposure will take a few moments. How long exactly? Thomas asks, already fighting the urge to shift his weight. I've never been good at staying still. We're all aware of that, James remarks dryly. Henry chuckles. Just 30 seconds. Modern photography is much faster than it was when we were children. He glances at his pocket watch. Remember those portraits Father commissioned when we were boys? We had to sit perfectly still for nearly 5 minutes. Mother was convinced Thomas would never manage it. But I did, Thomas says with unexpected pride. For her I did. Henry sets the timer, then hurries to join his brothers, taking his place beside James. The 5 Blackwood men, all sharing the same strong jaw, the same dark eyes, face the camera solemnly, as was the custom for photographs in those days. Despite their differences, the family resemblance is unmistakable, a testament to the strong Blackwood bloodline that Edward had always emphasized in his rare moments of paternal pride. No one move, Henry cautions, as the shutter clicks and whirs. For those 30 seconds, time seems suspended. The garden is eerily quiet. No bird song, no rustling leaves, as if nature itself is holding its breath. A cloud passes momentarily over the sun, casting a brief shadow across the brothers before moving on. There, Henry says when the exposure is complete. I'll develop it immediately. Father has allowed me to use the old still room off the kitchen as a dark room. I'm surprised Father remembered your interest in photography, Charles comments as they walk back toward the house. He was never particularly supportive of artistic pursuits. Henry shrugs. Perhaps illness has softened him, or perhaps Mother's wishes carry more weight now that she's gone. Thomas snorts. More likely he's finally realized that having a son with connections in European art circles adds to the family prestige. Everything with Father comes down to the Blackwood name and its standing. That's unfair, Thomas, James reproves, though without much conviction. Father built an empire from what Grandfather left him. His concern for the family legacy is natural. Natural, perhaps, William says thoughtfully, but often stifling. Do you know he nearly disowned me when I chose archaeology over law? Only Mother's intervention changed his mind. She intervened for all of us at one time or another, Charles acknowledges. Even for you, James, though you were always the favorite. James bristles slightly. I wasn't favored. I simply fulfilled my responsibilities to the family. As the eldest, spare us the lecture, Thomas interrupts. We've heard it all before. As they reach the terrace, Harrington appears with a silver tray of refreshments, iced tea and small sandwiches arranged with geometric precision. I thought you might appreciate some refreshment after your time in the garden, he says, setting the tray on a wrought iron table. Thank you, Harrington, William says warmly. You're as thoughtful as ever. Will you join us? Henry invites, always the most democratic of the brothers. The butler smiles but shakes his head. Most kind, Master Henry, but I must oversee preparations for dinner. Your father has instructed cook to prepare all your favorites from childhood. It promises to be quite a feast. As Harrington departs, Thomas raises an eyebrow. All our favorites? Father must be feeling nostalgic in his old age. Or guilty. Guilty of what? Charles asks sharply. Thomas waves a hand vaguely. Who knows? The great Edward Blackwood has never been forthcoming about his affairs, business or personal. Later, as dusk approaches, Henry emerges from the makeshift darkroom he's set up in a storage closet off the kitchen. The chemical smell of developer and fixer clings to his clothes, and there are silver nitrate stains on his fingers, honorable marks of his craft. His face is ashen as he enters the dining room where his brothers are enjoying pre-dinner drinks. The dining room is illuminated by the newly installed electric lights, Edward Blackwood having embraced this modern convenience despite his otherwise conservative tastes. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the mahogany table, set for 6 with the family's finest china and silver. Portraits of Blackwood patriarchs line the walls, their stern gazes following the movements of their descendants. A fire crackles in the marble fireplace, taking the edge off the autumn evening chill. What's wrong? William asks, noticing Henry's expression. Did the photograph not turn out? It turned out, Henry says slowly, his voice unusually strained. But there's something I can't explain. He places the photograph on the table, handling it carefully by the edges as his training demands. The brothers gather around, glasses of whiskey and brandy momentarily forgotten. The image shows the 5 brothers, perfectly composed, their features clear against the backdrop of autumn foliage. The exposure is excellent, with sharp detail and good contrast, a testament to Henry's skill and his modern equipment. But there, on the ground before them, are 6 shadows. 5 shadows extend naturally from the 5 brothers, but the 6th, a distinct human silhouette, falls across the garden path with no visible person casting it. The brothers stare in bewilderment. The silence in the room is absolute save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the occasional pop from the fireplace. It must be a flaw in the development process, James says dismissively, though he can't quite take his eyes off the anomalous shadow. Or a trick of the light. Henry shakes his head emphatically. I've been developing photographs for years. This is neither. The chemicals were fresh, the process was perfect, and look at the definition of that shadow. It's as clear as our own. Thomas laughs nervously, reaching for his glass and taking a larger swallow than usual. Perhaps it's Mother's ghost, come to join her boys for the portrait she always wanted. Charles picks up the photograph, examining it closely with a doctor's analytical gaze. The shadow appears to be that of a man, approximately our height and build. It falls exactly as it would if someone were standing here. He points to an empty space beside William. This is nonsense, James declares, though his usual confidence wavers slightly. There's a logical explanation. A double exposure, perhaps. Impossible with this camera, Henry insists. and I checked the negative. It shows the same thing. William, however, has gone very quiet. The academic's usual eloquence seems to have deserted him as he stares at the photograph. There's recognition in his eyes, or perhaps fear. "Do you recall the stories grandmother used to tell us?" he asks finally. "About the Blackwood curse?" Thomas rolls his eyes, though the gesture seems forced. "Old wives' tales. Grandmother was half senile by the time we were born." "What curse?" Charles asks. Though born a Blackwood, he had always distanced himself from family superstitions, preferring the certainties of medical science to folklore. William hesitates, then explains, his professor's voice taking on a storyteller's cadence. "Grandmother claimed our great-grandfather made his fortune not through honest railroading, but by betraying his business partner, his own brother. According to her, the brother disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1857, and his spirit is bound to this house, seeking vengeance on the Blackwood line." "That's preposterous," James scoffs, running a hand through his impeccably groomed hair. "Father built this house in 1880. There was nothing here before." "Not exactly," William counters. "The main structure is new, yes, but it was built around an original hunting lodge that dates back to the 1840s. The East Wing, where Father keeps his study, is part of that original building. I researched it for a paper on Victorian architectural appropriation of earlier structures. Even if that's true," Charles says carefully, "it doesn't explain a shadow with no owner. There must be a scientific explanation." Henry retrieves the photograph from Charles. "Science doesn't explain everything, brother. In my travels, I've seen things that defy conventional understanding. The camera sometimes captures what the eye cannot see." "Spiritualist nonsense," James dismisses. "Next, you'll be holding seances and claiming to communicate with the dead, like Mother did?" Thomas says quietly. The words fall into the room like stones into still water. The brothers stare at Thomas, who suddenly looks more sober than he has all day. "What did you say?" James demands. Thomas meets his gaze unflinchingly. "You didn't know?" In her final years, when the doctors had given up, Mother turned to spiritualists. I found her once, in the conservatory with a medium from Boston. They had a Ouija board and were trying to contact someone. Mother made me swear not to tell Father. "She never mentioned this to me," James says, clearly disturbed by the revelation. "Nor me," William adds. "She wouldn't have," Thomas replies. "You both worship at the altar of rationality, just like Father. But Mother, she believed there were things beyond our understanding, things tied to this house and to our family." The conversation is interrupted by Harrington announcing dinner. The photograph is temporarily forgotten as the brothers make their way to the dining room, where they are surprised to find their father already seated at the head of the long mahogany table. Edward Blackwood is a shadow of his former self, once a bull of a man who commanded respect with his mere presence. He now appears shrunken in his wheelchair, a wool blanket covering his legs despite the warmth of the evening. Yet his eyes remain sharp, taking in his 5 sons with calculated interest. "My boys," he says, his voice still carrying the authority that built an empire. "All grown men now. Sit, sit." Dinner is a tense affair, with Edward questioning each son about his achievements and failures over the past years. James speaks proudly of his banking ventures, William of his academic publications, Charles of his medical research. Henry mentions a photography exhibition in Paris, while Thomas remains conspicuously silent about his own activities. "And what of you, Thomas?" Edward finally asks. "Still wasting your allowance on cards and chorus girls?" The middle son meets his father's challenging gaze. "Actually, Father, I've been exploring investments in moving picture houses. The cinematograph is the future of entertainment. I've secured options on several properties in New York that would be ideal for conversion." Edward's eyebrows rise slightly, perhaps the closest he comes to showing surprise. "Is that so? Well, at least you're thinking like a businessman, even if your choice of industry is unconventional." It's as close to approval as Thomas has received in years, and he sits back, visibly pleased with himself. James looks skeptical, but holds his tongue. As the main course is being cleared, Henry interjects. "Father, something strange happened with the photograph we took today." He retrieves the image from his pocket and passes it to Edward. The old man studies the photograph, his expression unreadable. Then, to everyone's surprise, he begins to laugh, a harsh, brittle sound that dissolves into coughing. "So he's shown himself at last," Edward says when he recovers, dabbing at his mouth with a monogrammed handkerchief. "After all these years." The brothers exchange confused glances across the table, the crystal glasses and silver candelabra reflecting their bewildered expressions. Outside, the wind has picked up, rustling the ivy that climbs the mansion's walls. "Who, Father?" James asks, leaning forward. Edward doesn't answer immediately. His gnarled fingers tap a rhythm on the arm of his wheelchair as he studies his son's faces, perhaps searching for something. Finally, he rings a small silver bell, and Harrington appears with practiced promptness. "Bring me the box from the safe in my study," Edward instructs. "The one with the brass lock." As Harrington departs, Charles clears his throat. "Father, if you know something about this photographic anomaly, we would appreciate an explanation. Henry's professional reputation could be at stake." Edward's laugh is softer this time, but no less disturbing. "Your brother's reputation is secure. What you've captured, Henry, is something that has been part of this house longer than any of you have been alive." Harrington returns with a wooden box, ornately carved with the Blackwood family crest, an oak tree split by lightning. He places it before his master with reverence. Edward opens it with gnarled fingers to reveal a stack of sepia-toned photographs, yellowed with age and carefully preserved between sheets of tissue paper. "These are all the family portraits taken in this house since it was built," he says, his voice taking on the quality of a storyteller. "Look closely." The brothers gather around as Edward lays out the photographs one by one. In each image, spanning decades, the same anomaly appears. A sixth shadow without an owner, always in slightly different positions, but unmistakably present. Family groups, formal portraits, even casual snapshots, all show the mysterious extra shadow. "I don't understand," Charles says, his scientific mind struggling against what his eyes are seeing. "What does this mean?" "It means," William says slowly, "that grandmother's stories had more truth to them than we knew." Edward sighs heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. "It means the time has come for the truth. Harrington, bring me the journal." The butler returns moments later with a leather-bound book, its spine cracked with age and pages yellow and brittle. Edward opens it carefully, handling the fragile pages with surprising tenderness. "This was written by my father, your grandfather, Jonathan Blackwood. He died before any of you were born." Edward pauses, seeming to gather his strength. What William said about the curse is partly true, but the story goes back further than he knows. As a storm begins to gather outside, casting the dining room into deeper shadow, Edward tells a tale that has been buried for half a century. His voice, weakened by age and illness, nevertheless commands the brothers' complete attention. Even Thomas has set aside his usual flippancy, leaning forward to catch every word. In 1847, 3 Blackwood brothers, Jonathan, Frederick, and Alexander, founded a modest shipping company in Boston. Born to a teacher and a seamstress, the brothers had worked their way up from poverty through intelligence and ambition, qualities that Edward had always insisted were the true Blackwood inheritance, more valuable than any monetary fortune. As railways began to revolutionize American transport, the brothers pivoted their business, investing everything in a railroad venture that connected Boston to the rich farmlands of western Massachusetts. Success came swiftly, but with it, discord. Alexander believed Jonathan and Frederick were cheating him out of his fair share, Edward explains, running a finger along a faded page of the journal. He was the youngest, more volatile than his brothers, and perhaps more visionary. He wanted to expand west, to California, while Jonathan and Frederick preferred to consolidate their eastern holdings. Edward turns a page in the journal, revealing a faded ink drawing of 3 men who bear a striking resemblance to the current generation of Blackwoods. The same strong jaw, the same penetrating eyes that stare out from the brittle paper with uncanny familiarity. "There was a terrible confrontation here, on this very property," Edward continues, his voice dropping to just above a whisper, forcing his sons to lean closer. Though the house had not yet been built, it was just a hunting lodge then, purchased with the first profits from the railroad venture. The brothers would retreat here to discuss business away from the distractions of Boston society. Lightning flashes outside the windows, momentarily illuminating the tense faces of the 5 brothers. Thunder follows seconds later, closer now as the storm approaches the estate. Alexander disappeared that night. Jonathan's journal claims he simply left, abandoning his stake in the company and heading west. The official story, reported in the Boston papers, was that Alexander Blackwood had gone to seek his fortune in the California gold rush, like so many young men of that era. Edward pauses, taking a sip of water from a crystal glass that trembles slightly in his hand. His sons wait, barely breathing, for him to continue. But Frederick confessed something different on his deathbed. The old man's eyes grow distant, as if seeing the scene play out before him. I was just a boy, no more than 12, when Uncle Frederick fell ill with consumption. He lingered for months, wasting away in the very room that is now my study. As death approached, he became obsessed with clearing his conscience. Another flash of lightning, another rumble of thunder, closer still. The lights flicker momentarily. Frederick admitted that he and Jonathan fought with Alexander that night at the hunting lodge. It wasn't meant to end in violence, but in the heat of the argument, Alexander threatened to expose what he called their creative accounting to their investors. Jonathan, always the practical one, tried to reason with him. Frederick, always the hothead, tried to intimidate him. Edward's fingers traced the outline of the three brothers in the faded drawing. The confrontation escalated. Alexander turned to leave, to walk back to town in the rain, but Frederick grabbed him. There was a struggle. Alexander fell, striking his head on the hearthstone. He died instantly. A heavy silence falls over the room, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the increasing intensity of the storm outside. The candles on the table flicker in a draft that seems to come from nowhere. Rather than face scandal that would ruin their business, they buried Alexander on the property and agreed never to speak of him again. They told everyone he had gone to seek his fortune in California. Later, they even sent forged letters, supposedly from Alexander in San Francisco, to maintain the illusion. My God, William whispers. They murdered their own brother and covered it up. It was an accident, Edward corrects sharply. At least that's what Frederick claimed. But yes, the cover-up was deliberate and calculated. The railroad business was expanded using Alexander's share of the profits. This house, our family legacy, was built quite literally on his grave. And you believe this ghost story? James asks incredulously, though his usual skepticism sounds hollow. That Alexander's spirit haunts us through photographs. Edward fixes his eldest son with a hard stare. I believe that blood demands justice, one way or another. Every generation of Blackwood since has been haunted, shall we say, by unexpected tragedies. My own father died young, falling from a horse on this very property. My brother Richard drowned in the lake when we were boys. Your mother's illness was but the latest manifestation. The brothers shift uncomfortably, each recalling the mysterious ailment that had claimed their mother's life after years of suffering, a progressive paralysis that had confounded the best medical minds in Boston and New York. You can't possibly blame mother's illness on a family curse, Charles objects, medical training overcoming his growing unease. Her symptoms were consistent with several neurological conditions that we're only beginning to understand. Perhaps, Edward concedes. Science and superstition often overlap in ways we don't fully comprehend. But consider this. Every Blackwood who has dismissed the curse has suffered for it. Every Blackwood who has acknowledged Alexander's fate has lived a long, if not entirely peaceful life. A particularly violent gust of wind rattles the windows, and the electric lights go out completely, plunging the dining room into darkness except for the candles on the table. Their flames cast elongated shadows on the walls. 6 distinct silhouettes, though only 5 brothers and their father are present. Perfect timing, Thomas mutters, reaching for the decanter to refill his glass. Harrington enters with additional candelabras, which he places strategically around the room. The storm has affected the power lines, sir, he informs Edward. I've instructed Jenkins to check the generator, but it may be some time before electricity is restored. Thank you, Harrington, Edward says calmly. You may retire for the evening. We'll see to ourselves. The butler hesitates, glancing at the scattered photographs and the open journal. Are you certain, sir? Given the circumstances. Quite certain, Edward assures him. This is a family matter now. With a slight bow, Harrington withdraws, closing the heavy oak door behind him. The sound of rain intensifies, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. The will reading tomorrow is a formality, Edward continues, returning to business. Your mother left everything to be divided equally among you, but there's a condition. You must all spend tonight in the house together. She believed that only by confronting the past could the Blackwood line have a future. James frowns. A condition in Mother's will requiring us to stay here tonight specifically? That seems oddly prescient. Your mother had insights none of us fully understood, Edward says quietly. In her final years, she became convinced that Alexander's spirit was trying to communicate with her. The specialists called it delirium from her medication, but she was lucid until the end. What exactly did Mother believe Alexander wants? William asks, the academic in him still seeking logical patterns even in this most illogical situation. Recognition, Edward says simply, to be acknowledged as a Blackwood, not erased from our history, to have his remains properly buried in the family plot, with his name restored to the family records. That's all? Thomas sounds skeptical. No revenge? No dramatic justice? Edward regards his middle son with unexpected sympathy. Not all spirits seek vengeance, Thomas. Some merely seek peace. With that, Edward signals to Charles, who wheels him from the room, leaving the four remaining brothers alone with their thoughts and the disturbing photographs spread across the table. Outside, the storm rages with increasing ferocity, as if nature itself is responding to the revelation of long-buried secrets. As night deepens, the storm intensifies. Rain lashes against the windows, and wind howls through the eaves of the old house. The brothers retreat to the library, where a fire roars in the massive stone fireplace. Thomas breaks out the brandy, and for once, James doesn't object. The comfortable room, lined with leather-bound volumes collected by generations of Blackwoods, has always been a refuge, but tonight it feels more like a fortress against the growing unease that pervades the mansion. Do you actually believe any of this? Thomas asks after his second glass, sprawled in one of the deep leather armchairs. A family curse? A vengeful ghost? I believe in science, Charles says firmly. Having returned from settling their father in his chambers, there must be a rational explanation for the shadow. Like what? Henry challenges. I've taken thousands of photographs. I know every technical flaw that can occur. This is something else entirely. Henry retrieves the original photograph from his pocket, studying it again under the warm glow of the library's oil lamps. Rational or not, this shadow is real. I saw nothing unusual when I took the picture, yet here it is. William has been browsing the library shelves and returns with a dusty tome bound in faded red leather. This is a history of Essex County, published in 1890. It might mention the Blackwood brothers and the railroad company. A history that would have been written after the fact, James points out, based on the story our great-grandfathers wanted told. True, William acknowledges, but historians sometimes include details inadvertently that reveal more than intended. As my doctoral advisor used to say, history is written between the lines as much as in them. As William searches through the book, the lights flicker, then go out completely, plunging the room into darkness, save for the fireplace glow. The sudden absence of electric light is jarring, making the comfortable library seem suddenly vast and full of unknown corners. Perfect timing, Thomas mutters, fumbling to light a cigarette with a silver lighter. The small flame illuminates his face momentarily, casting strange shadows on the wall behind him. Harrington enters with an armful of candles, which he distributes around the room with practiced efficiency. The storm has affected the electrical lines, gentlemen. It happens frequently, I'm afraid. The backup generator should engage shortly for the essential areas of the house. Essential areas meaning father's quarters, I assume, Thomas remarks dryly. Your father requires constant temperature and lighting for his health, sir, Harrington confirms without a hint of apology. The generator has limited capacity. As Harrington works, a candle's flame suddenly bends sideways, as if in a draft, though the windows are sealed tight against the storm. The temperature in the room drops noticeably, the sudden chill raising goosebumps on exposed skin. Did you feel that? Henry asks, shivering despite the fire's warmth. Before anyone can respond, a loud crash comes from the hallway. The brothers rush out to find a large portrait, their grandfather Jonathan, fallen from the wall, its heavy frame shattered on the marble floor. The canvas itself has torn, creating a jagged gash across the stern patriarch's face. Just the storm, James insists, though his voice lacks conviction. The old house settles during weather changes. The portrait has hung there since before we were born, Charles observes, kneeling to examine the broken frame. Through countless storms, more severe than this one. They return to the library, but the comfortable atmosphere has evaporated. William continues poring over the county history book by candlelight, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound journal he carries. Charles examines the original photograph with a magnifying glass borrowed from the writing desk, while Henry stares into the fire, lost in thought. Thomas paces restlessly, unable to settle, while James stands at the window, watching the storm lash the gardens into submission. Here, William says finally, excitement coloring his scholarly voice. There's a small mention of the Blackwood brothers and their railroad company. Listen to this. The Blackwood Rail Company, founded by brothers Jonathan and Frederick Blackwood in 1847, revolutionized transport between Boston and the western counties. No mention of Alexander. That proves nothing except that he was written out of the official history, James counters. William turns another page. But look at this. An obituary for Alexander Blackwood, dated November 1847. It says he died in a tragic accident while en route to California. The youngest of the Blackwood brothers, known for his adventurous spirit, met his untimely end as he sought his fortune in the gold fields of the West. He is mourned by his brothers Jonathan and Frederick, who have established a memorial fund in his name for the education of promising young engineers. So they covered it up, Charles says quietly, created a public story to explain his disappearance. If Father's story is true, James points out, still unwilling to fully accept the supernatural implications, this could all be an elaborate fabrication. Father has always had a flair for the dramatic, especially where family legacy is concerned. The grandfather clock in the hall strikes midnight, its chimes eerily loud in the storm-hushed house. The brothers count silently, 12 sonorous notes that seem to vibrate through the old walls. As the last stroke fades, the library door slams shut of its own accord. Thomas, nearest to the door, leaps up to open it, but the handle won't turn under his grip. "It's stuck," he says, rattling it forcefully, a note of panic entering his voice for the first time. "Or locked," Henry suggests, joining his brother at the door. Charles approaches the door, examining it closely with his doctor's methodical precision. "There's no key in this lock. It can't be locked from the outside without one. Perhaps it's jammed," James suggests, taking his turn to wrestle with the handle. "The humidity from the storm could have caused the wood to swell. In the last 30 seconds? William asks skeptically. A sudden gust of wind blows through the room, though all windows remain closed. The fire in the grate flares dramatically, then subsides to embers, casting the room into near darkness. At the same moment, all the candles extinguish simultaneously, as if a great breath had blown them out. Only the dying fire remains, casting long dancing shadows on the walls, and there, among them, a shadow that moves independently, advancing toward the brothers. "Do you see that?" William whispers, pointing with a trembling finger. They back away collectively as the shadow moves across the floor and up the wall, a perfect silhouette of a man, though no one stands where it should originate. It grows larger as it approaches, elongating to an impossible height, before shrinking back to human proportions. "This isn't happening," James mutters, but there's no conviction in his voice, only growing terror. Thomas makes a dash for the door again, throwing his weight against it. It gives way suddenly, sending him sprawling into the hall. The others follow quickly, Henry grabbing the photograph and William the county history book as they flee. The hallway is pitch black, no candles or electric lights to guide their way. Only the occasional flash of lightning through the tall windows offers brief illumination of their surroundings. In those staccato bursts of light, the house seems transformed, unfamiliar despite being their childhood home. Shadows move oddly, and the brothers could swear the portraits on the walls follow their frantic progress with painted eyes. "We need to find Father," James says decisively, assuming leadership as he has since they were children. "He clearly knows more than he's told us. If this is some elaborate test," Thomas adds, "I'm going to be furious." They make their way through the darkened house toward the west wing, where Edward's chambers are located. The storm rages outside, lightning illuminating their path through the long corridors in irregular, blinding flashes. Thunder follows immediately after, suggesting the storm is directly overhead now. The house creaks and groans around them, timbers protesting against the wind's assault. At one point, Charles stops abruptly, causing Henry to collide with him. "Listen," he whispers. In the momentary silence between thunderclaps, they hear it, footsteps, coming from the corridor behind them. Slow, deliberate steps that echo on the marble floor, growing closer. "Harrington?" William calls out, his voice cracking slightly. No response, only the steady approach of the unseen walker. "Run," Thomas says simply, and they do, dignity forgotten as they race through the darkness toward their father's wing. They find Edward's room empty, the bed unslept in. The electric lights are functioning here, powered by the generator, creating a jarring contrast to the darkness of the rest of the house. The room is meticulously organized, medications arranged precisely on the bedside table, a wheelchair positioned near the window, books stacked according to size on a small desk. Perhaps he's in his study, William suggests, trying to control his rapid breathing. The study door is ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. Inside, they find their father seated at his desk, writing in a leather-bound journal similar to his father's. He looks up, unsurprised to see them, as if he has been expecting their arrival at precisely this moment. "It's begun, hasn't it?" he asks simply, setting down his pen. James steps forward, his usual composure shattered by the night's events. His hair is disheveled, his tie askew, small details that speak volumes about his distress. "Father, enough of these games. The house is playing tricks on us because of the storm, nothing more." "Is that what you truly believe, James?" Edward asks, studying his eldest son with penetrating eyes. "You who have always prided yourself on facing reality, however unpleasant." "I believe in what I can see and touch," James insists, though his voice wavers slightly. "In ledgers and contracts, not ghost stories." Edward shakes his head slowly, disappointed but not surprised. "Not the storm, James. Alexander. He's restless tonight because you're all here. All the Blackwood blood gathered under one roof. It rarely happens anymore." "We saw a shadow," Charles interjects, his scientific mind still struggling to process the night's events. "A shadow that moved independently, with no visible source." "And you heard footsteps," Edward adds, though none of them had mentioned this to him. "Following you through the east corridor." The brothers exchange alarmed glances. Thomas takes an involuntary step back, bumping into a bookshelf. "How did you know that?" William asks. "Because I've experienced it myself many times over the years," Edward replies. "This house has never been entirely empty." "If this is about family guilt," Charles interjects, medical training providing a framework for understanding, "then surely there's a way to make amends. In some cultures, proper burial rites or commemorations can appease restless spirits. If Alexander's remains are indeed on the property." "We tried," Edward interrupts, wheeling himself away from the desk toward the fire that burns in the small hearth. "My father tried everything. Christian burial, mediums, exorcisms. Nothing worked. The shadow remains." Outside, the storm seems to intensify in response to Edward's words. Rain lashes against the windows with renewed fury, and a particularly violent gust of wind causes the entire house to shudder. "Then what does it want?" Henry asks, clutching the photograph that started the night's revelations. Edward's gaze is distant, looking beyond his sons to some point in the past only he can see. Justice, perhaps, or maybe just acknowledgement. The erasure of Alexander from our family history was his second death, worse in some ways than the first. A crash of thunder shakes the house to its foundations. The lights flicker wildly, casting the study into alternating brightness and shadow, before stabilizing. "I believe," Edward says slowly, his voice taking on a formal quality, "that one of you must make a choice tonight. The curse demands a sacrifice." The word sacrifice hangs in the air, heavy with ominous implications. "What kind of sacrifice?" William asks, his academic curiosity piqued despite his fear. "Not what you're thinking," Edward says with a slight smile. "Not blood or life. The sacrifice of pride, perhaps. Of the lies we've told ourselves about who we are and where we come from." Edward opens a drawer in his desk and removes an iron key, old and heavy, its design archaic compared to the more modern locks in the house. He holds it out, and after a moment's hesitation, James takes it, the weight of it surprising him. In the cellar, behind the wine racks, there's a door that hasn't been opened in decades. Perhaps the answers lie there. "You want us to go into the cellar?" Thomas asks incredulously. "Now? During a storm with a ghost on the loose?" "I can't compel you," Edward says. "The choice must be yours. But consider this. For 5 generations, Blackwoods have lived with this shadow, this secret. Would you pass it to your children, and their children after them?" The question resonates differently with each brother. James, with his 3 young sons in Boston. William, whose wife is expecting their first child. Charles, engaged to be married next spring. Henry, still single but contemplating a return to America permanently. Thomas, who despite his carousing has begun to think of his legacy. "We'll go," James decides, closing his fist around the key. "All of us, together." The brothers exchange uncertain glances, but curiosity overcomes their apprehension. Led by James, they make their way from the study toward the servants' stairs that lead to the cellar. Edward remains behind, watching them go with an expression that mingles hope and trepidation. The cellar is vast, stretching beneath the entire east wing of the mansion. Stone steps, worn smooth by generations of servants' feet, lead down into darkness that seems almost solid. James leads the way, holding aloft one of the candelabras from Edward's study. The flames cast jumping shadows that dance across the walls, making every corner and crevice seem alive with movement. "I haven't been down here since we were children," Henry remarks, his voice hushed. "Remember when we used to sneak down to steal apples from the storage bins? And Harrington would pretend not to notice," Charles adds with a faint smile, though he always left the door unlocked on delivery days. The shared memory provides momentary comfort as they descend deeper into the house's foundations. The air grows cooler, heavy with the sense of earth and wine, and something older, more primitive, the breath of buried time. The main cellar chamber is lined with brick arches, a testament to the craftsmanship of another era. Rows of wine racks hold bottles covered in dust and cobwebs, many dating back to before the brothers were born. Wooden crates and barrels line the walls, containing supplies for the household, preserved foods, candles, linens, all meticulously organized in the Blackwood way. "The wine cellar is through here," James says, leading them through an arched doorway into a separate chamber where temperature and humidity are carefully controlled. Here, the family's impressive collection of wines, French, Italian, Spanish, some bottles worth more than a working man's yearly wage, rest in specially designed racks. "Father said behind the wine racks," William reminds them, examining the walls. "But which one?" "The room contains 12 large racks, each holding hundreds of bottles. Searching behind each would be a time-consuming task." "There," Charles says suddenly, pointing to the far corner. "That rack is different from the others." He's right. While most of the racks are made of the same dark oak as the house's furnishings, one rack in the corner appears older, constructed of a lighter wood with a different design. It also sits slightly away from the wall, creating a shadow behind it that the others lack. The brothers approach the rack cautiously. Thomas runs his hand along the edge of it, feeling for a mechanism. It's not attached to the wall, he discovers. "I think it moves." With James and William helping, they carefully slide the heavy rack away from the wall, taking care not to disturb the valuable bottles it holds. Behind it, partially hidden in shadow, they find what they're looking for. A small door made of dark wood bound with iron straps set into the stone wall. James hesitates, then inserts the key. It turns with surprising ease, as if the lock has been recently oiled. The door swings open with a low groan of hinges, revealing a narrow tunnel carved into the earth beyond. "I didn't know this existed," Thomas whispers, peering into the darkness. "All those childhood explorations, and we never found this." "None of us did," William replies, examining the door frame with professional interest. "This predates the house. Look at the construction. This is mid-19th century work, consistent with the original hunting lodge." "Should we go in?" Henry asks, a mixture of fear and excitement in his voice. James nods grimly. "That's why we're here." He leads the way, ducking to avoid the low ceiling. The tunnel extends about 30 feet before opening into a small chamber. Their candles illuminate rough stone walls and a packed earth floor. The space is perhaps 15 feet square, empty except for a few rotting wooden shelves against one wall and, most disturbingly, a rectangular depression in the center, approximately the size and shape of a grave. "He's buried here," Charles says, a statement rather than a question. His medical training has familiarized him with death, but the thought of a body interred here for over half a century sends a chill through him nevertheless. As if in answer, their candles gutter, the flames bending toward the depression. The temperature drops sharply, their breath visible in the sudden cold. The hair on the backs of their necks stands on end, a primal response to the unseen. And then, from the shadows at the edge of the chamber, a figure emerges. Not solid, but not quite transparent either. A man in 19th century clothing, with the unmistakable Blackwood features, stares at them with hollow eyes. His form wavers slightly, like a reflection in disturbed water, but the details are clear enough. The same strong jaw they all share, the same set of the shoulders that marks the Blackwood men. He appears to be in his early 30s, younger than any of them except Henry. Thomas swears and stumbles backward, colliding with the rough wall behind him. Even James, always composed, cannot hide his shock. William stands transfixed, the historian in him momentarily overcoming his fear at witnessing such an impossibility. Charles blinks rapidly, as if expecting the figure to vanish when he opens his eyes. Henry alone seems almost prepared for the apparition, his artist's sensitivity perhaps more attuned to the boundaries between the seen and unseen. "Alexander," William says softly. The figure inclines its head slightly, as if in acknowledgement. Henry, trembling visibly, raises his camera and takes a photograph. The flash momentarily blinds them all. When their vision clears, the figure is gone. "Did you see that?" Thomas gasps. "Tell me you all saw that." "We saw it," Charles confirms, his scientific mind struggling to process what his eyes have witnessed. They return to the main house in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. In the library, they find Edward waiting, looking older and more frail than ever. "You've seen him," he says. It's not a question. James nods. "What happens now?" Without further discussion, they begin to dig in the rectangular depression. The earth is surprisingly soft, yielding easily to their shovels. It's clear that, despite the passing of decades, this soil has been disturbed more recently than 1847. Father said they tried proper burial rites. Charles reminds them as they work. This may have been excavated before. They dig in shifts, the confined space allowing only two to work at a time. James and William take the first turn, then Thomas and Charles, while Henry keeps the lantern positioned for maximum visibility. Despite the chill in the chamber, they soon perspire from the exertion, removing jackets and rolling up shirt sleeves. After nearly an hour of digging, James's shovel strikes something solid. They freeze, exchanging glances before carefully clearing away more earth to reveal their discovery. It's a wooden box. Not a proper coffin, but a simple pine crate. Its wood darkened with age, but surprisingly intact in the dry conditions of the underground chamber. "This can't be original," William observes, examining the construction. "This wood would have rotted away completely if it had been here since 1847. Someone has moved the remains more recently." "Father," Charles suggests. "Or grandfather, perhaps, trying to lay Alexander to rest properly without actually removing him from the property." Together, they lift the box from the earth and place it carefully beside the hole. The lid is nailed shut, but Thomas produces a pocket knife with various tools, including a small pry bar. With careful leverage, they manage to loosen the nails and lift the lid. Inside, they find not a complete skeleton as expected, but a collection of bones carefully arranged. A skull, still bearing traces of dark hair, and larger bones that would constitute the core of a human frame. The smaller bones, fingers, toes, vertebrae, are missing, either lost to time or never included in this reburial. A partial reinterment, Charles says, his medical training allowing him to maintain clinical detachment, the essential elements for symbolic burial, but not a complete recovery of the remains. Nestled beside the skull is a tarnished pocket watch, its case engraved with the initials AB and a signet ring bearing the Blackwood family crest. These personal effects, preserved despite the decades underground, provide final confirmation of the remains' identity. "Alexander Blackwood," James says solemnly, "our great-grand-uncle, denied his rightful place in life and in death," William adds. A sudden chill passes through the chamber, stronger than before. The lantern flickers, but remains lit. In its wavering light, they see the apparition has returned, standing at the edge of the shadows. His expression is different now, less mournful, more expectant. "He wants us to take him home," Henry says softly, "to the family plot. Now, in this storm." Thomas objects again, but with less conviction than before. "Yes, now," James decides. "We've come this far. We'll finish what our ancestors should have done decades ago." They find an old blanket in the cellar to wrap the remains, treating them with dignity despite their condition. The box is too deteriorated to transport safely, so they leave it behind. James carries the bundled remains as they make their way back through the tunnel, up through the cellar, and into the main house. The storm continues to rage outside, but they're committed now. In the entrance hall, they find Harrington waiting with raincoats and umbrellas, as if he'd anticipated their need. "The family mausoleum key, sir," he says, handing an ornate iron key to James. "Your father suggested you might need it tonight." "He knew," Thomas says. "He knew exactly what would happen." "Your father has been preparing for this night for many years," Harrington confirms, "as did your mother before her illness prevented her participation." Outside, the rain is torrential, turning the gravel paths to streams and the lawns to swamps. They struggle toward the family plot, a small private cemetery enclosed by wrought iron fencing at the edge of the formal gardens. At its center stands the Blackwood Mausoleum, a neoclassical structure of pale marble that gleams ghostly white in the storm-dark night. James unlocks the heavy bronze door, which swings open with surprising ease despite the weather. Inside, the air is still and dry, the space illuminated by the lantern they've brought. Stone shelves line the walls, holding the remains of Blackwoods going back 3 generations. Marble plaques identify each niche, recording names, dates, and brief epitaphs. There, on the central wall, they find what they're looking for. 3 niches arranged side by side. 2 are occupied, labeled for Jonathan Blackwood, 1812-1878, and Frederick Blackwood, 1815-1865. The 3rd niche is empty, but a plaque has been prepared. Alexander Blackwood, 1818-1847, with the epitaph, "Lost but not forgotten." Father prepared this. William realizes he knew this day would come. With solemn ceremony, they place Alexander's remains in the empty niche. Henry, always the most spiritual of the brothers, offers a brief prayer. James, as the eldest, adds the pocket watch and signet ring before they seal the niche. As they complete this act, a change comes over the mausoleum. The air, which had been unnaturally still, stirs with a gentle breeze that seems to circle the chamber before dissipating. The oppressive sense of presence that has followed them throughout the night lifts, replaced by a feeling of peace. Outside, they notice the storm has begun to subside. The rain lightens to a gentle patter, and the wind, which had howled with such fury, calms to a whisper. As they make their way back to the house, the clouds begin to part, revealing glimpses of a night sky brilliant with stars. They return to the house to find Edward waiting in the grand hall, his wheelchair positioned beneath the portrait of his father, Jonathan. The old man looks both exhausted and relieved, as if a great weight has been lifted from his shoulders. "You've done it," he says simply. "You've laid him to rest. How did you know what we would find?" James asks, removing his rain-soaked coat. "How long have you known about Alexander's fate?" "I've known since I was a boy," Edward admits. "Frederick's deathbed confession to my father was only part of it. The shadow in the photographs confirmed what the stories suggested. But it wasn't until your mother fell ill that I began to truly understand the connection." "Mother knew too?" Charles asks. Edward nods. "Elizabeth was more perceptive than any of us gave her credit for. She felt Alexander's presence from the moment she entered this house as a bride. What I dismissed as feminine superstition, she recognized as truth. In her final years, as her body failed her, her sensitivity to the unseen grew stronger. The spiritualists Thomas mentioned," William recalls. "Yes," Edward confirms. "Not charlatans, as I initially believed, but genuine seekers who helped her communicate with Alexander's spirit. It was through them that she learned what was needed. Not just reburial, but acknowledgement. The Blackwood family had to confront its past publicly." "And that's still your intention?" James asks cautiously. "To expose our family's darkest secret to the world? The will reading tomorrow isn't just about money," Edward explains, echoing his earlier words. "Your mother has arranged for a journalist from the Boston Globe to be present. She intended for the full story of Alexander Blackwood to be published, the truth revealed at last. That could ruin us," James protests, ever mindful of the family's business interests. "The scandal would be significant," Edward agrees, "but perhaps necessary. The question is whether you 5 are willing to sacrifice your pride, perhaps even some of your fortune, to right an old wrong." The brothers exchange glances, a silent communication passing between them. It is Henry who speaks first. "I believe we've already answered that question tonight," he says quietly, "when we carried Alexander home." Thomas nods, surprisingly solemn. "I'm not eager for scandal, but I'm even less eager for another night like this one. If public acknowledgement is the price of peace, so be it." "William? Charles?" James looks to his other brothers, seeking consensus. "As a doctor, I've learned that festering wounds must be cleaned before they can heal," Charles says, "no matter how painful the process. And as a historian," William adds, "I believe in the importance of truth, however uncomfortable. We can't change the past, but we can correct how it's remembered." James, the last holdout, sighs deeply. "Very well. For Mother's sake, and for the future of the Blackwood line, I agree." Edward smiles, a rare expression of genuine warmth. "Your mother would be proud. Now, I suggest you all get some rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Dawn breaks over the Blackwood estate. The storm clouds dispersed to reveal a clear autumn sky. The gardens, though battered by the night's tempest, glisten with raindrops that catch the early light like countless tiny prisms. The house itself seems different somehow, lighter, as if some oppressive atmosphere has lifted with the passing storm. The five brothers, having barely slept, gather in the morning room where Harrington serves coffee. Despite their exhaustion, there's a sense of accomplishment among them, a bond forged through their shared experience. Henry has spent the night developing the photograph taken in the underground chamber. He places it on the table for all to see. The image shows the stone chamber, the grave-like depression clearly visible. And there, standing beside it, is Alexander Blackwood, no longer a shadow, but a translucent figure, his features unmistakably similar to those of the five brothers. The family resemblance is striking, another piece of evidence confirming their shared blood. "It's remarkable," William murmurs, examining the photograph closely. This may be the first documented image of a spectral apparition captured under controlled conditions. James, who has been the most skeptical throughout, picks up the photograph, studying it intently. The banker's analytical mind still searches for rational explanations, but faced with the evidence of his own experience and the clear image before him, his doubts are crumbling. If we do this, if we allow this story to be published, everything changes. Father's right about that. Perhaps it's time for change, Charles suggests, stirring sugar into his coffee with a surgeon's precision. Secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch. Look what happened to Mother. Thomas, surprisingly sober this morning, nods in agreement. I've spent years trying to escape this family's shadow. Quite literally, it seems. Maybe facing it is the better path. We should be prepared for the consequences, William cautions, ever the practical academic. The revelation that our railroad fortune began with fratricide will shock Boston society. Business partners may distance themselves. Social invitations might dry up. Let them, Henry says with unexpected vehemence. I've lived in Paris long enough to know that American society's memory is short and its morality flexible. A scandal today is forgotten next season, especially when attached to a fortune as substantial as ours. James manages a thin smile. You're probably right. Money has a way of making even the most egregious sins forgivable. Besides, Charles adds, the actual events occurred over 60 years ago. None of us were even born. We're acknowledging our ancestors' misdeeds, not confessing our own. A maid enters to announce that breakfast is served in the dining room, where Edward is already waiting. The brothers find their father looking better than he has in months, some vital energy restored to his frame. Though still confined to his wheelchair, he sits straighter, his eyes clearer. You all look terrible, he observes with a hint of his old sardonic humor. I trust you found sleep elusive after last night's adventures. That's putting it mildly, Thomas replies, helping himself to eggs and bacon from the silver serving dishes. I doubt I'll sleep soundly in this house ever again. On the contrary, Edward says, I suspect you'll find it more peaceful than ever. I certainly did. For the first time in decades, I slept without dreams. The solicitor arrives at 10 o'clock, accompanied by a young woman who introduces herself as Margaret Wells, a journalist with the Boston Globe. She is perhaps 30, dressed in a conservative but fashionable suit that marks her as a modern professional woman. Her notebook is already in hand, pencil poised to record whatever unusual story she expects to hear. The brothers exchange knowing glances as Harrington shows the visitors into the grand sitting room, where a small table has been arranged with the legal documents. Miss Wells, Edward greets her warmly. Thank you for coming all this way. I trust your journey wasn't too difficult after last night's storm. Not at all, Mr. Blackwood, she replies with professional courtesy, though the roads were rather muddy. Your man Jenkins was kind enough to meet me at the station with a motor car. Mr. Simmons, the family solicitor, clears his throat. A small, precise man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed mustache. He has managed the Blackwood legal affairs for over 20 years, succeeding his father in the role. Shall we proceed with the reading? He suggests, arranging his papers. I understand you have a train to catch this afternoon, Miss Wells. The will reading proceeds formally in the grand sitting room. As expected, Elizabeth Blackwood's considerable personal fortune, separate from the family business holdings, is to be divided equally among her 5 sons, with generous provisions for the household staff who had cared for her during her long illness. Then comes the unusual clause, a sealed letter to be read aloud in the presence of all 5 brothers and the journalist. Edward hands it to James, who breaks the seal and begins to read his mother's final message. My beloved sons, it begins. If you are hearing these words, then you have fulfilled my wish to gather once more as a family. You have also, I suspect, encountered the truth that has haunted our family for generations. The truth of Alexander Blackwood. James's voice falters slightly, but he continues, aware of the journalist's keen interest and rapidly moving pencil. The shadow that appears in every family photograph taken in this house is not a curse, but a reminder, a plea from a man whose existence was erased by his own brothers. Alexander was not only murdered, but denied his rightful place in history and in our family's memory. The sitting room is silent save for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the scratching of the journalist's pencil. Miss Wells's professional composure slips slightly, her eyes widening at the mention of murder, but she continues to take notes without interruption. I have arranged for the truth to be published at last. It is my belief that only by acknowledging Alexander, by restoring his name and his story, can our family find peace. The shadow persists because the lie persists. Let truth be his monument. James looks up from the letter, meeting each of his brother's eyes before turning to the journalist. There is more, Miss Wells. A story that began in 1847 and has remained hidden until now. I'm listening, Mr. Blackwood, she says, turning to a fresh page in her notebook. James looks to Edward, who nods encouragement. Last night, my brothers and I discovered the remains of our great-grand-uncle Alexander Blackwood hidden on this property. We also encountered something else, something that defies conventional explanation. Over the next hour, the brothers take turns relating the events of the previous night, supporting their account with the photographs Henry has developed, both the original image showing the sixth shadow and the more startling one capturing Alexander's spectral form in the underground chamber. Miss Wells listens with professional skepticism that gradually gives way to cautious belief as the evidence mounts. She examines the photographs carefully, asks pointed questions about the family history, and takes meticulous notes throughout. This is extraordinary, she says finally. I must ask, why now? Why, after keeping this secret for generations, have you chosen this moment to reveal it? Edward speaks up. Because the past cannot remain buried forever, Miss Wells. Because my wife, before her death, came to believe that the tragedies that have befallen our family, including her own illness, were connected to this unacknowledged crime. And because, as she wrote, truth is the only lasting monument. I see, the journalist says thoughtfully. And you understand that publishing this story will likely cause a sensation. There will be those who question your motives, who suggest this is a fabrication, perhaps even a publicity stunt. We're prepared for that, James responds. The Blackwood name has weathered worse storms. Well, my sons, Edward says at last, the choice is yours. Miss Wells will publish this story only with your consent. The five brothers look at each other, a wordless communication passing between them. It is Henry who finally speaks. Alexander Blackwood deserves to be remembered, not as a ghost story, but as our great-grand-uncle, a founding member of the family business. He turns to the journalist. We consent to the publication, Miss Wells. We'll provide all the evidence we have, including the photographs. The others nod in agreement, even James, though his expression remains troubled. Then I shall do my best to tell his story with the dignity it deserves, Miss Wells promises, closing her notebook. The Sunday edition goes to press in 3 days. You'll have an opportunity to review the article before publication, of course. As the legal formalities conclude and Miss Wells prepares to depart, Mr. Simmons draws James aside for a private word. Are you certain about this course of action? The solicitor asks in a low voice. Once published, this story cannot be recalled. The implications for the family business have been considered, James interrupts firmly. Some things are more important than business, Mr. Simmons. My mother understood that, even if it took me longer to see it. That afternoon, as Miss Wells's motor car disappears down the long driveway, the brothers gather once more in the garden where their own portrait was taken the previous day. The storm has passed, leaving the air washed clean and the sky a perfect autumn blue. The fallen leaves have been swept away by the groundskeeper, and late-blooming chrysanthemums add splashes of color to the formal beds. One more photograph, Henry suggests, adjusting his tie. For ourselves, to document this moment. Do you think it wise to tempt fate again? Thomas asks, only half joking. Yesterday's photograph started this whole ordeal. I think it's fitting, William replies. A before and after, if you will. A record of what changed when we confronted our past. Charles nods thoughtfully. It would be an interesting experiment from a scientific perspective. If Alexander's presence manifested as a shadow because he was unacknowledged, then logically, now that we've acknowledged him, the shadow should be gone, James finishes. Very well, Henry. Set up your camera. Henry retrieves his equipment from where he'd left it in the morning room. The magnificent Kodak is loaded with a fresh plate, its brass fittings gleaming in the autumn sunlight. He sets it up with methodical precision, checking the angle and the light. Same positions as yesterday, he directs, assuming the role of photographer rather than subject. James standing center, William and Charles seated, Thomas by the balustrade. They arrange themselves as before, James standing tall at the center, William and Charles seated on the bench, Thomas leaning against the balustrade, Henry setting the timer before joining the group. This time, however, there's a marked difference in their demeanor. Where yesterday they were stiff, formal strangers reunited by obligation, today they stand as brothers united by a shared experience and a common purpose. As the shutter clicks, a sense of lightness seems to settle over the garden, as if a long-held breath has finally been released. A gentle breeze stirs the remaining leaves on the maple trees, sending them dancing across the lawn in spirals of red and gold. I've been thinking, Charles says as they walk back toward the house. If we're to acknowledge Alexander properly, we should do more than just publish the story. His contributions to the founding of the railroad should be recognized in company records. Agreed, James says, surprising his brothers with his ready acceptance. I'll have the corporate histories amended, and we should establish a scholarship in his name, perhaps at the engineering school at MIT. He was the visionary who saw the potential of westward expansion after all. I'll speak to the board of trustees, William offers. As a Harvard professor, I have some influence there. Perhaps an Alexander Blackwood Fellowship for students of railway engineering. I could curate an exhibition, Henry suggests eagerly, using the photographs as a centerpiece but incorporating historical documents, maps of the original railroad, perhaps even personal effects if any survived. The watch and ring, Thomas reminds him. Those were buried with him, but I imagine Father might have other items in his possession. Edward does indeed have more of Alexander's belongings. A journal, discovered decades later in a hidden compartment of the hunting lodge during renovations. Letters written to friends in Boston before his disappearance. Sketches of proposed railway routes that proved remarkably prescient as the nation expanded westward. These items are brought out over dinner that evening, passed around the table with a reverence previously reserved for the most valuable Blackwood heirlooms. Edward, more animated than his sons have seen him in years, shares stories passed down from his father. Not the sanitized version of family history they grew up with, but honest recollections that include Alexander's brilliance, his fiery temperament, his visionary thinking that often put him at odds with his more conservative brothers. He was brilliant but difficult, Edward explains, quick to anger, slow to forgive. The tensions between the brothers had been building for months before that fatal night. It doesn't excuse what happened, but it helps explain it. Human complexity, William muses. The very thing history often fails to capture. We reduce people to heroes or villains, when the truth is always more nuanced. When Henry develops this final image later that evening, it shows the five brothers, their expressions more relaxed than in the previous day's photograph. And on the ground before them are exactly 5 shadows, no more, no less. The anomaly that had persisted for generations has vanished, as if Alexander, acknowledged at last, has found his peace. The story of Alexander Blackwood and the brothers who betrayed him appears in the Boston Globe the following Sunday. As predicted, it causes a sensation, not just in Boston but across the country, picked up by newspapers as far away as San Francisco and New Orleans. The combination of wealth, family betrayal, and supernatural elements proves irresistible to the public imagination. The scandal is significant but brief. The public's appetite for century-old mysteries is limited. The Blackwood Railroad fortune suffers some minor damage as investors react nervously, but the family business ultimately survives, partly due to James's skillful management of the crisis. He neither confirms nor denies the supernatural aspects of the story in his public statements, focusing instead on the family's commitment to historical truth and their efforts to honor a forgotten founder. More importantly, Alexander's remains are properly exhumed from the mausoleum and given a formal burial service in the family plot, attended not only by the 5 brothers and their father but by extended family members and prominent Boston society figures. His name is added to the Blackwood Mausoleum alongside his brothers, the dates of his birth and death carved in matching marble. A photograph of the 3 original Blackwood brothers, reproduced from Jonathan's journal, is displayed prominently in the mansion's entrance hall, with Alexander's name and contribution clearly identified. As winter descends on Massachusetts, the 5 current Blackwood brothers return to their separate lives, changed by their experience, but also more connected to each other. The bonds forged during that stormy night prove enduring. They correspond regularly, sharing news and insights that would have gone unmentioned in previous years. James remains in Boston, his banking career continuing to flourish, though he now finds time to mentor young financial talents from less privileged backgrounds. William's academic focus shifts slightly toward investigating historical erasures, the people and events deliberately removed from official records. Charles establishes a small research foundation dedicated to studying unusual psychological phenomena, funding serious scientific inquiry into experiences traditionally dismissed as supernatural. Henry divides his time between Paris and Boston, his photography increasingly celebrated for its ability to capture not just images but emotions. And Thomas, perhaps most transformed, channels his energies into the emerging motion picture industry, his theatrical instincts finding their perfect outlet in this new medium of storytelling. They gather more frequently in the years that follow, not just for funerals or business matters, but for Christmas celebrations, summer picnics, and to mark the birthdays of their growing families. Edward Blackwood, his health stabilized, if not improved, watches with quiet satisfaction as his sons build relationships he had never quite managed with his own siblings. And in every photograph taken at the Blackwood estate from that day forward, the shadows match precisely the number of people present. No more, no less. Alexander Blackwood, acknowledged at last, has found his peace. Henry Blackwood's exhibition, Shadows of the Past, the visual history of the Blackwood family, opens at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in the spring of 1909. The centerpiece is the original photograph, the one showing 5 brothers and 6 shadows, displayed in a silver frame commissioned specially for the exhibition. Beside it hangs the second photograph, taken after Alexander's reburial, showing 5 brothers and 5 shadows. The exhibition draws record crowds, attracting both those fascinated by the supernatural implications and serious historians interested in the documented case of historical erasure. The scholarly catalog, with essays by William Blackwood and several prominent historians, becomes a foundational text in the emerging field of photographic analysis. As for the Blackwood mansion itself, it remains in the family for generations, though its character changes subtly after that fateful autumn weekend. The oppressive atmosphere that had always permeated certain rooms lifts, replaced by a warmth previously lacking. Visitors comment on the home's welcoming feel, unaware of the decades when servants refused to enter certain areas after dark and family members avoided the East Wing entirely. Some say that on stormy nights when the wind howls through the eaves of the old Blackwood mansion, a figure can be glimpsed moving through the gardens, not threatening, but watchful. The current generation of Blackwoods doesn't fear this presence. They understand it as a guardian rather than a ghost, a reminder that family bonds transcend even death, and that acknowledgement is the most powerful form of remembrance. The photograph that started it all, the one showing 5 brothers and 6 shadows, passes to Henry after Edward Blackwood's death 3 years later. Henry keeps it in his studio, not as a curiosity, but as a reminder of the night they confronted their family's past and chose truth over comfortable lies. In 1925, as the last of the 5 brothers, Henry donates the photograph to the Smithsonian Institution, along with his complete documentation of the events of that October weekend in 1907. His accompanying letter explains, "This image represents not just a family mystery resolved, but a fundamental truth about human history, that the unacknowledged past remains present, casting shadows into our lives until we have the courage to face it directly. For what is a shadow but proof of existence? And what is memory but the shadow of a life, persisting long after the person who cast it has gone? The 6th shadow that had no one casting it now has a name, a story, and a place in family history. And in that recognition lies a peculiar kind of immortality, not the ghostly half-life of the wronged and forgotten, but the lasting legacy of the remembered and honored. In the soft glow of an autumn afternoon, much like the one in 1907 when 5 brothers posed for a photograph, the Blackwood estate stands proud against the rolling Massachusetts countryside. The shadows are long but natural, each belonging to someone, each acknowledged, and that, perhaps, is all that Alexander ever wanted.